And this actually really does impact us, right? It impacts how we communicate with one another, how we describe certain situations, and how we feel. And again, without communication, it's really friggin' hard to get through life. We are so reliant on each other, whether you want to admit it or not, we are. And so we need to be able to successfully communicate with one another. And there's a great article that was actually released on the BBC that actually talks about, will emoji become a new language? And this is interesting to think about because, language originated from pictograms, from hieroglyphics, from images on a cave wall, from someone basically seeing something, experiencing something, and wanting to express it. And it's like, well, what is the best way to express it? Well, language really wasn't a thing then. Maybe sounds, maybe gesticulations, using our arms to try to tell a story. But really the core thing or go-to originally was the image, right? The picture. And so now we've implemented these pictures once again in a very interesting way, right? Like it's come back full circle. We went from starting with pictures, advancing into elaborate language with actual grammatical rules and certain codes of conduct and engagement. And now we're sort of going back to that sense of image, of picture. And it's really cool in a way, but some people are very concerned that this could be like the linguistical Armageddon. Well, for instance, where did the emoji really come from? Well, of course, from the advancement of technology. As technology advanced, we were able to connect to one another much easier, but it was all through mostly text, right? Especially in the 90s where we weren't doing things like Skype or FaceTime or anything like that.
Well, you had to type on the phone that you had, on the flip phone you had, right? You had to.
Oh yeah, you had to do the T9 and hit like the 3 button 3 times just to get to the letter that you needed, and then jump down. And
so emojis made sense. Oh, I can just do a smiley face. Here you go.
Yeah, and it's not even just a shortcut either, though. It really is also a way to put in intention, because you could say something multiple times and mean many different things from it, right? Like, for instance, are you being flirtatious or are you being a smartass? Again, a winky face or a smiley with blowing hearts could mean, oh, okay, they're being flirtatious more so than a real smartass or being mean. And that's actually one of the examples they use in the article, which it makes sense, right? There are many different edges to how we use our words. And it's really important to try to make sure we get intent across. Otherwise, we get confusion and sometimes just a lot of arguments because people think you're being a smartass when you're not, or that you're being dishonest when you're not. And it's all based on not just how we word things, but how we would describe them. Because as you can see, like right now, I'm using my hands, right, to describe, to tell a story. And so with this, if we take that away, we can't use our hands now. We can't show facial expressions. How do we show intent? And that's through these emojis.
Well, and even to those of us listening this as a podcast, you can probably tell some of the intent just from the emotion, the inflection in our voice, which again, you can't when you send a text.
Exactly. If we were typing all this out right now, you would not get the sense of exactly what's behind the words, because there's always something behind our words typically, some sort of meaning. I mean, for instance, I do this when I train actors, when we're going through different classes. I said there's a big difference between looking at someone smiling and going, oh, hi. And there's a bigger difference when all of a sudden you go, oh, hi. Same words, but again, the intention is different. And it's amazing to think that emojis have really come in to help express us more. And, we live stream on Twitch, and emotes are such a huge part of the culture here on Twitch because of that very reason. It's a great way of not only, in a way, simplifying something. Instead of typing out a whole sentence, you can describe it in an emoji or an emote, but also it just helps bring out that intent. But it seems interesting to question, will this become its own sort of language? I mean, there are certain kind of grammatical rules that emojis can tend to follow. For example, when you're trying to describe an event, let's say like a birthday. Well, if someone asks, well, what are you doing tonight? You could show literally like a birthday gift to show that, well, we're going to do presents. We're going to have a cake. And then I'm going to go home drunk. Whatever it may be, you can show that. And typically we do things in the order that we do them by. And, it follows many other things. For instance, if we say, well, what did you do last night? You can say, well, me, show a person, and then show the individual events or items that are happening within that day. So we typically put the subject first, at least within Western culture, and then what's happening.
And I think we have that particular image as well.
Yeah, so if we go to the emote language, so for instance, what did you do last weekend? And we see here, for instance, the person, well, myself, I, so in this case it was a woman, so they showed a image of a woman, and then celebrating, drinking wine, gifts. Oh, it was a surprise because then at the end there was a cake. And you can tell that whole story just by the images, just by the emojis.
And currently in our chat, people are talking in emojis as well, which is hilarious.
And, many people say, well, this is kind of like, in a way, like where, like sign language is kind of coming from too, right? You see things, you figure out a way of describing them, and you come up with a visualization for what that is. And so just as we gave certain ways of moving our hands in intent behind that, when we don't have that, we do it through emoji. And they actually did they had a really interesting situation happen where in Nicaragua, they actually brought multiple children together who had kind of created their own sign language separately. They were in smaller villages or smaller cities, and they were brought together, and they found that they kind of created their own sign language. That had nothing to do with the official sign language of that country. And they were amazed to figure out that these kids could still communicate with one another.
Yeah, they basically, they didn't have any exposure to any language, but they invented their own system to communicate, and they call these home signs. And of course, this particular system is limited in the size of the vocabulary and the types of sequences you can create. You can't, I don't think anyone's doing past participle of the future tense or all those things. But that is very similar to how we use emojis, like you mentioned, okay, well, here's the subject, kind of more basic in a way, here's the subject, here's the activity, here's how I felt, right? Like you can kind of get a sense of that as well. But kind of like the supplements that we were talking about earlier, emojis too, at least certainly right now, unlike pictograms or hieroglyphics, were developed to supplement or enhance what we were saying, right? What we were texting, what we were writing. And I mean, right now, like I walk in the, IRL, I say LUL and kappa after certain sentences because I have now somehow appropriated the Twitch emotes that we use on Twitch as a real thing, as a way to express that intent, even though obviously, or I'm hoping, the people I'm talking to understand that I am laughing out loud because I am laughing out loud and I find that funny. But that's another way to, I think, I think I primarily use it to just bring more humor into it, but they are definitely taking on their own life. And the other thing that is fascinating to me, that why emojis are blowing up, is that much like different languages, there's also different sets of emojis, right? Like we were just talking about, well, Twitch has its own emojis or emotes, and then of course depending on what channel you're in, they'll have their own emotes, but then iOS, right, Apple products have kind of their own set of emojis. Android has its own sets of emojis. If you play Heroes of the Storm, they have their own sets of emojis. And as somebody who may want to use these in places where they can't access them,
right,
that brings off another interesting concept, right? Because okay, they even if emojis blow up and it's the next way we're going to all talk to each other, which set of emojis, is it going to be like the English language version of emojis? Is it going to be another one? Because, maybe we can say that, well, a smiling emoji pretty much means the same in every culture, every language, everywhere in the world. Maybe. But what about all the other emojis, right? Like, I remember I was in a chat with somebody not from the US, and I used a particular emoji, and they didn't understand what it was because they had never experienced what that emoji was representing.
Right.
And so that was fascinating to me. I'm like, oh, wow, you don't know this? Like, okay, well, so now I have to explain what it is, right? And then I had to resort back to words.
Well, it's because it's all based on intent through a cultural lens. That, for instance, like humor can be very different from the U.S. standpoint to like the Middle East standpoint on what is humor. I've used this example before when we've talked about language, is the fact that when one of the X-Men films came out, I was in Cairo at the time with a group of American students, and we were there visiting and taking classes. And, we decided, well, let's go out to see a movie and stuff like that. Like, we need to get out, we need to get around other people. And I remember a certain point in the film where we found it as U.S. citizens very funny, and we just laughed out loud. Everyone else was dead quiet. Talking about awkward here. I mean, like super awkward, like crickets could have been heard clearer than them. And they all just kind of looked at us like, what the hell was so funny? And it really hit us like, oh yeah, that's right, that you have this kind of cultural lens. So also the intent even behind emojis, just like with language, can be a real thing.
Yes, and Culperistic brings up a great point in chat that the nuance of language has to do with shared understandings of cultural history and experiences. And the reason that emojis are successful as an aid to communication is because we're all experiencing and learning this grammar behind emojis at the same time.
So it's like we're almost all speaking the same language in a way. And that's another point too, the fact that emojis can help connect us if we don't speak perfectly another language or understand all of the kind of nuances behind a language. Hopefully, ideally, a sort of communication bridge of sorts would be emojis or some kind of visual representation.
And then you'd have, there is a emojipedia.org, if anyone's ever interested in checking it out, to kind of see all the emojis that I guess are out there. I don't know if they, I don't know where they're necessarily getting their information from or how much they have there, but it is interesting to see sort of a catalog, like a dictionary.
Oh, yeah.
And then at that point, too, you can figure out maybe what's the etymology of an emoji, right? Where did the dancing girl in the red dress come from? Like, I have no idea, but I use it. And I have a sense of what it potentially means, but usually I just use it to mean like, oh, I am dancing, and not anything with like red or a dress or the fact that it's a woman. So it's fascinating. And which brings me to another point that I want to make, which is that we actually need digital devices to express the emojis, right? To actually utilize them. I don't think I've ever tried to draw the lady in the red dress.
Well, and that takes more time, right, than just saying a lady in the red dress or
right.
a red dress.
Exactly. But when I talk about the emoji of the woman in the red dress, potentially people who have seen it know exactly instantly what I'm referring to, which is another good point that emojis have, which they're able to express something that visually a lot of people have, like that have seen it, can instantly understand. Oh, it was a long dress, kind of looks, like she's fancy wearing dress, like it's not like a short skirt, or it's so there are benefits, to using certain emojis, but they're on digital devices. So if you don't have a digital device, how are you going to use them? In terms of it blowing up and being the next language that we all speak, right? There's not actually that many people in the entirety of the world that have digital devices that can express emojis, right? And also it's very hard to duplicate them in systems that only use a certain set of emojis. So, I mean, I don't think we're going to get to linguistic Armageddon mostly because it's just not accessible in the same way to everybody. But I think that if it was, I think we would, because to some degree, pictograms, hieroglyphics, that type of stuff is easier, I think, for the eye to just pick it up real quick.
Even though there's still a lot open to the imagination, because again, when we talk about like cultural lenses, there's that sense of perception and how we can look at the same thing and perceive two very different situations or scenarios happening. It's kind of like a Rorschach test, right? You see it and one person sees death, another one sees a dog, another one sees an angel. And it can be varied based on our personal baggage that we carry around with us, our experiences and the things that we come across. So, it's very difficult to say, oh yeah, emojis will definitely take over language because of that. And because we can perceive a winky face both as potentially being flirtatious, as being, joking, like wink, wink, nudge, nudge, or you're being an asshole and you're putting salt in the wound. So it can mean multiple things. And there's also the fact of, as Tatiana mentioned, okay, well, do you speak Google emoji? Do you speak, like Android? Do you speak iOS emoji? Do you speak Twitch emote? Like, and that's the thing too. There's so many different things depending on the platform. And actually, to highlight something here, one of the individuals who is mentioned in this article by BBC wrote a book called The Visual Language of Comics, which I thought was very interesting. I never thought about the visual language of comics. But again, then, we have a film and video background as well as a theater background. So we understand visual, right? But I never thought about then inserting it into like graphic novels and comic books, which it completely makes sense now I see it. But they mention that there is also a systematic visual vocabulary in comic books. I mean, you think about it, when you see a bubble or a bubble-like shape, what comes to mind? Oh, they're thinking. It's a thought. It's a thought bubble. If it has well-rounded edges, they're speaking, they're saying something. For instance, too, like when stars go over, you'll see this in the old cartoons, when stars hovered over someone's head, that basically 99% of the time meant they were dizzy. Maybe they got bonked in the head or something like that, went dizzy. But it's amazing that we've taken imagery, we've assimilated it, and put it into a specific industry or niche, and everyone understands it when they see it. They go, that's a thought, that's a statement, they're dizzy, they smell bad. Whatever it is, we've taken these shapes and turned them into a language without realizing it. So I think we naturally do it to everything in a way anyway. And so no matter what, are we going to escape the concept of the pictogram or the hieroglyphic? No, absolutely not. But is something like an emoji going to become an official language? I never really see everyone doing every single statement in an emote or emoji. So I personally doubt it very much though. So I don't think it's going to hurt language overall, though it might make things a bit interesting. It will change things in how we talk and at what length we talk.
Right. At this point, I feel like with emojis too, because they're sort of punctuations, if you will,
right,
or enhancements on what we're saying. I think if anything, they are making us a little lazier in how we talk, but that's really texting's fault. Let's be real. But yeah, there's something to be said about, as Culperistics mentioned, if Jonathan Swift had emojis, it would it have ruined his satirical essay about cannibalism? Satire, that's at least written satire, right? If you just put a bunch of emojis, it would actually make it even cartoonish, right? Like it would take away some of the weight, quote unquote, that it would have, right? I mean, sure, yeah, I can write a poem with just emojis, but how would that be experienced by other people? How would that be shared by other people?
Well, and what is the point of the written language or how you're trying to communicate at that specific instance? For example, many writers and many poets, when they're writing out, what they're writing, whether it be a book or a poem or what have you, a lot of times they want the audience to have an aha moment. But when you're doing it in emojis, a lot of times it can either, again, confuse or take away that aha moment or that experience of going, oh, I get what they're doing there. and getting that rush of dopamine and that good feeling from, like, solving something, right? And I think that's a point to many people and how they write and what point they're trying to get across. And sometimes we can take that away from the experience or the overall experience of reading, because a lot of times, depending on if it's an artistic platform or not, what we say is not always, or I guess what we write or what we say, it isn't just for face value. There's a lot more behind it. And there are times where people are trying to make a point and make people come to a realization that if we did something that was completely drawn out, they may never experience and get to.